I wanted to give you an update following the Chancellor's announcement in Parliament regarding the new job support scheme. So the furlough scheme comes to an end at the end of October, and from the 1st of November then, for a period of 6 months, there will be what is known as the job support scheme. So this is a scheme designed to help employers to support employees in what the Chancellor called viable jobs. So what they're doing to try to ensure that it is jobs that are viable is that they're saying that it really is only open to employees who are working at least 1/3 of their normal contracted hours. So if a job's not viable anymore and isn't there anymore, this scheme is not designed for that. But if a job is there but there's a reduced requirement for it to be done for the period between November and April, and it needs to be done on fewer hours than what the employee is contracted to, well then this scheme is intended to support that scenario. So what will happen is the employee will work at least 1/3 of their normal working hours, and then they will be paid that by their employer as normal. What will happen then in relation to the rest of the hours is the government and the employer and the employee will share the cost of that. So for the employee who is working 1/3 of the normal working hours, the remaining 2/3 then will be split as follows. 1/3 of the remaining 2/3 will be paid for by the employer. So the employer will make payment for hours not worked. 1/3 will be paid by the government, and 1/3 will be written off by the employee or not payable to the employee. So this graphic will hopefully help to explain that in a little bit more detail. So what we have here are two scenarios. On the left hand side we have where the employee works the minimum number of hours required under this scheme, which is 1/3, and you'll see there what the proportions are for what is paid by the employer for hours not worked, what the government contribution is, and then what the employee would not be paid as a proportion of their overall package. And then on the right hand side then you'll see the proportions if the employee is working 1/2 of their normal contracted hours. I should say that just like the tapering down of the furlough scheme, the government contribution will not include the employer national insurance and pension contribution on that proportion, and so while the government will make a contribution to the gross wage, the employer then will have to top that up by the amount of the employer national insurance and pension contribution on that proportion of the wages. So that is the same as what the employer has been required to do over the last couple of months of the furlough scheme. And also, like the furlough scheme, the government contribution under this scheme is subject to a cap. And then what we have on this slide is a comparison between what the position would be in October under the furlough scheme as compared with the job support scheme from November to April in the event of an employee working 50% of their hours. And you can see there clearly that the employer contribution is increasing and the government contribution is decreasing. It's also worth mentioning that one of the differences between the furlough scheme and the new scheme is that the employer can't use the new scheme for an employee who is serving their notice. So a few other things that we know at this stage. So the government issued a sort of press release or a briefing in relation to this. So this is not just open to employers and employees who had been using the job retention or furlough scheme. So anybody who has been employed by their employer on or before the 23rd of September is eligible for this job support scheme. And the Chancellor has indicated as well that anybody who has previously been furloughed and who remains employed until the end of January, well, their employer will still be able to avail of the £1,000 job retention bonus. So the company can still avail of that and this job support scheme. We don't know yet what the position will be in relation to whether or not an employee only working part of the week can take or can be made to take a period of annual leave during the portion of the week that the employee isn't working. So I can see how it would be attractive to an employer to say, well, if we have to top up your wages by an extra third for the time that you're not, a third of what you're losing out on by not working your normal contracted hours, then we want you to take some annual leave during that. That was okay during furlough, so I suspect that'll be okay during this job support scheme period, but further detail is awaited on that point. Who is likely to avail of this? Well, any employer who thinks that they want to retain good staff and who thinks that the downturn will be temporary might consider this if they don't already have a contractual right to reduce employees' hours in the contract. If there is a contractual right to reduce hours of work in the event of a downturn, then that is probably the more attractive option to the employer, because in those circumstances then the employer is only paying for the hours worked, subject to some complicated rules around payment of statutory guarantee pay, particularly if the employer can guarantee employees will be working 50% of their hours or more. Then invoking a contractual right to reduce hours would be probably the better option rather than availing of this job support scheme. And if you're wondering why that is and you want further advice on that, then get in touch, because it's probably too complex to go into in detail in this short video. So in summary then, if you don't think the job is viable in the longer term, then this job support scheme is not going to be appropriate. The more appropriate thing to do is make redundancies. If you have the contractual right to reduce working hours in the contract of employment, then invoking that right is likely to be better than the job support scheme. If, however, you don't have that contractual right and you think that your downturn is temporary and you can provide some work for employees but just not their full contracted hours, well then in those circumstances the job support scheme may be a good option for you. And just like with the furlough agreements, there will be a requirement to enter into a written agreement with the employee that they agree to forego a proportion of their wages if you're making use of the job support scheme without the contractual right to reduce hours.